Theresa May vowed to expel 23 Russian spies today as she laid out Britain's retaliation over the Salisbury nerve gas outrage. In the biggest diplomatic swipe for decades, the Prime Minister gave the undeclared intelligence agents a week to leave the country and suspended all high-level contact with the country. Mrs May also paved the way for a crackdown on Russian oligarch money in London and urged the international community to join sanctions. As relations with Moscow reached new lows in the wake of the attack on former spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. The Premier also suggested that covert reprisals would be undertaken in an apparent hint at cyber attacks. Mrs May said she was determined that the package would fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capability in the UK. They have treated the use of this poison with sarcasm and disdain. There is no other conclusion other than that the Russian state was responsible for the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Mrs May said Britain has made a formal protest at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, slamming Vladimir Putin's regime as reckless. The government has also called for an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council. But Russia immediately threatened to hit back in kind after being notified of the reprisals at the Foreign Office. Ambassador to the UK Alexander Yakovenko branded them a provocation and unacceptable. Earlier, Vladimir Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Moscow has nothing to do with the accident in Britain. Moscow does not accept unfounded accusations that are not based on evidence and a language of ultimatums in a dramatic escalation of the spat with Russia. Mrs May said under the Vienna Convention the United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This will be the single biggest expulsion in over 30 years, and it reflects the fact this is not the first time that the Russian state has acted against our country. Through these expulsions we will fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capability in the UK for years to come. And if they seek to rebuild it we will prevent them from doing so. By contrast, just 4 diplomats were expelled following the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, in an apparent reference to the activities of Russian oligarchs. Mrs May said there would be tighter checks on those coming to the country. We will also table a government amendment to the sanctions bill to strengthen our powers to impose sanctions in response to the violation of human rights, she said. In doing so we will play our part in the international effort to punish those responsible for the sorts of abuses suffered by Sergei Marsky. Mrs May met her National Security Council this morning after winning support from allies including the US, Germany and France for reprisals. US President Donald Trump vowed to back the UK all the way in the standoff when he spoke to Mrs May by telephone last night. The PM had already secured the backing of German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron. European Council President Donald Tusk said today that the brutal attack could be put on the agenda for a summit next week. I express my full solidarity with PM Theresa May in the face of the brutal attack inspired, most likely, by Moscow. I'm ready to put the issue on next week's UKO agenda, he said. Russia had demanded to see samples of the Novichok substance found in Sergei Skripal's body before it considered responding to Mrs May's midnight deadline. Moscow's ambassador to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Alexander Shulgin, accused the UK of fomenting hysteria. Sooner or later they will have to be held accountable for their lies, he said in an extraordinary series of tweets last night. The Russian embassy to London posted threatening messages accompanied by pictures of what appears to be vials of poison. But UK Ambassador Julian Braithwaite told the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva this morning that Moscow's behavior was an affront. The Council and the United Nations General Assembly have decried Russia's violations of international law with alarming regularity, he said. Its reckless behavior is an affront to all this body stands for, a Foreign Office spokesman said. The UK has called for an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council to update Council members on the investigation into the nerve agent attack in Salisbury, as relations between the two countries hit the lowest point since the Cold War overnight. Nikolai Glushkov, the right-hand man of Mr. Putin's personal enemy number 1, was found dead at his London home. He is said to have borne marks of strangulation. It was also claimed that Mr. Skripal and his daughter might have been poisoned when the agent was smeared on the door handles of their car, following the call with President Trump. Downing Street said the Prime Minister spoke to President Trump earlier this afternoon, Tuesday, to update him on the ongoing Investigation into the Salisbury incident. The Prime Minister set out the conclusion reached by the UK government that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible for the attack against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. President Trump said the US was with the UK all the way, agreeing that the Russian government must provide unambiguous answers as to how this nerve agent came to be used in its string of messages last night. The Russian embassy feed stated Moscow will not respond to London's ultimatum until it receives samples of the chemical substance to which the UK investigators are referring. Britain must comply with the Chemical Weapons Convention, which stipulates joint investigation into the incident, for which Moscow is ready. Without that, there can be no sense in any statements from London. The incident appears to be yet another crooked attempt by the UK authorities to discredit Russia. Sunday, March 4th-4:15 p.m. Wiltshire police find a man and woman unconscious on a bench at the Maltings shopping centre in Salisbury and cordon off the area Monday. 5:11 a.m. Salisbury District Hospital, where the pair were taken, declares a major incident and its A&E department is closed. 8 p.m. Police officers are first seen outside Mr. Skripal's home in Salisbury. 10 p.m. Police closes Izzi restaurant near the shopping centre. Tuesday, 6:11.30 am. Police also cordon off the Bishop's Mill pub in Salisbury, where Mr. Skripal and his daughter may have gone after leaving Izzi. 9 p.m. Firefighters in hazmat suits are sent to an ambulance base in Amesbury, 8 miles away from the scene where they were found. Wednesday, 7th-3:30 p.m. Cordon around Mr. Skripal's house is extended to the top of the cul-de-sac. Thursday, 8th-2 p.m. Police were revealed to have cordoned off the graves of Mr. Skripal's wife and son in Salisbury. 2 p.m. Police also extend the cordon around Mr. Skripal's home from 50 yards to 150 yards and around the corner. 7:30 p.m. Police in protective gear go to Ashleywood Recovery in Salisbury to examine a maroon BMW 3 Series, the same car driven by the former spy. Friday, 9th-10 a.m. Military convoy of 180 troops arrives in Salisbury, including chemical weapons experts, to join the investigation. 3 p.m. Detectives in hazmat suits descend on Salisbury Cemetery and removed items from Mrs. Skripal and her son's grave. Sunday, 11th. The Army removed police cars and ambulances thought to have been contaminated. Monday, 12th. Army close off village of Winterslow and Sainsbury's car park in Salisbury to remove vehicles. Any threat to take punitive measures against Russia will meet with a response. The British side should be aware of that, following the call with Mrs. Merkel. Downing Street said they discussed the pattern of aggressive Russian behavior and agreed it would be important to act in unison with allies to counter it. Chancellor Merkel condemned the attack and said she stood in full solidarity with the UK. They agreed that the international community should coordinate closely as the investigation developed and in the wake of Russia's response. The former director of Britain's communications spying agency GCHQ, Robert Hannigan, said her response should include the expulsion of diplomats on a scale we probably haven't seen since the Cold War. Speaking to BBC Radio, Hannigan also backed hitting the economic targets, including Russians doing business in London, but warned against a large-scale cyber attack. Senior MEP Guy Verhofstadt offered EU support and said, "We stand shoulder to shoulder with the British people. It must be made clear that an attack against one EU and NATO country is an attack on all of us." British officials have been drawing up plans to hit back hard at Russia if they do not have an explanation. Tough sanctions could target the Kremlin and Putin's cronies, freezing assets and stopping them from traveling to the UK. They are also expected to expel many of Russia's diplomats, although probably not break off diplomatic relations altogether. British officials and the royal family are set to boycott the Football World Cup in Russia later this year. But Britain will need to get support from the UN and NATO allies in order to impose sanctions that will really bite and be felt by the Kremlin. The PM dramatically pointed the finger at Putin for the poison attack on Monday, saying it was highly likely it was linked to Russia. Branding the attack a reckless and despicable act, Mrs. May said the substance used was a military-grade agent Moscow has produced, together with Russia's previous actions and tactics, including the killing of Alexander Litvinenko. The UK authorities concluded it was highly likely to be involved in the episode. Mrs. May said the government would not accept such an attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said allies are mobilizing to support the UK and hit back at Russia. Speaking yesterday, he said, "I've been very encouraged so far by the strength of the support that we are getting. I think in particular from President Macron of France. I talked to Sigmar Gabriel, my German counterpart. And from Washington, where Rex Tillerson last night made it absolutely clear that he sees this as part of a pattern of disruptive behavior. Increasingly disruptive behavior, malign behavior by Russia, the reckless use of chemical weapons. The support for the reckless use of chemical weapons which stretches from Syria now to the streets of Salisbury. I've been encouraged by the willingness of our friends to show support and solidarity." Whitehall sources said they were accelerating their offensive cyber program and could hit select targets for a specific effect. It is understood this could see a specialist cyber unit deployed in the UK to attack Kremlin computer networks spewing Russian propaganda and trolling factories spreading fake news. General Sergei Skripal, commander of Joint Forces Command, has revealed how the UK has a specialist unit which is dedicated to offensive cyber run jointly by the MOD and GCHQ. So far it has worked on Islamic State, but this could be expanded towards Russia. Expel diplomats. Britain could expel Russia's ambassador and other diplomats based at the embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens, round the corner from where Prince William and Kate live. If MI5 have tabs on a Russian spying in the UK, Britain could take this poison plot as a reason to expel them. Impose sanctions. Britain already has an extensive range of sanctions against Russia as a result of the invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But we could extend them. The UK could also impose sanctions on named individuals if they are linked to the murder attempt. Britain could pass the Magnitsky List mirroring US laws imposing travel bans on senior Kremlin officials responsible for the death of Russian accountant Sergei Magnitsky in a prison in 2009. World Cup boycott. Official representation could be withdrawn from the World Cup in Russia if Kremlin links are proven. Prime Minister Theresa May told MPs last week that the government would look at whether ministers and other dignitaries should attend the tournament in that event. The Duke of Cambridge has already said he has no plans to attend. There have been calls for the England team to boycott the tournament, but their withdrawal would probably have little impact. A coordinated protest involving the withdrawal of multiple countries would be far more effective in damaging Vladimir Putin's showcase international event. However, experts say the nerve agent poisoning is unlikely to create enough international momentum to trigger a wider boycott. Statement of condemnation. Britain may call on to support its closest allies if there is evidence of a Russian murder attempt on UK soil. A joint statement of international condemnation could be issued from leaders including French President Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Angela Merkel, warning Russia that such actions will not be tolerated. In an interview with the Mail last week, he said the military could hit back at disinformation spread by Russian trolling factories. He said there are two ways you could respond. One is putting your own messages out to compete with the messages that actors like that are sending, and the other is with a cyber attack. Whether or not you could use cyber as a weapon would depend upon the specific circumstances and the law. He said that there was a specific capability in which troops tackle mistruths spread by enemies. Another option is for the government to implement a British version of the US's Magnitsky Act, which lists Russians involved in corruption and human rights abuses, banning them from entering the country. The Kremlin was given a deadline of midnight to respond to the evidence, but has refused to do so. Doubts were raised about the US's backing yesterday when Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was sacked hours after condemning Russia. However, it appears the axing of Mr. Tillerson was unrelated and Mr. Trump has now offered his support. Paralysis, convulsions, you can't breathe and after that you die. Scientist who helped create the lethal nerve agent Novichok used to attack Russian spy in Salisbury reveals its terrifying effects. The Russian whistleblower who exposed the country's secret chemical weapons program has revealed the horrific effect of the Novichok nerve agents on their victims. Vilma Zayanov described the use of the lethal toxins as a brazen attack by Vladimir Putin, who thinks he can use everything to kill enemies. Mr. Zayanov says a large dose of Novichok paralyzes victims before it causes convulsions, you can't breathe and after that you die. The exiled scientist shocked the world in 1992 when he revealed that promises by the Soviet Union to reduce its chemical weapon stockpiles were hollow. He worked in the top-secret Moscow laboratory where a new generation of even more potent poisons was being perfected. These gruesome chemical weapons, named Novichok after the Russian for newcomer, were designed to be even more lethal than VX or sarin. At the time, one former top Soviet military advisor described them as political weapons, adding they have a powerful moral and psychological effect. Shockingly, they can be created from common, unrestricted and undetectable industrial and agricultural chemicals available worldwide. As a result, weapons inspectors fear other rogue nations, including Syria and North Korea, could have their own lethal stockpiles of the powerful nerve agents. Speaking from his home in New Jersey, Mr. Mozayanov, 83, described the top-secret laboratory as a criminal enterprise. "It's a brazen attack," he said. "Putin thinks he can use everything to kill enemies. They don't tolerate any opponents. They should be punished. It's an open demonstration of this Russian terrorism. The Russian government is telling people who are thinking about revealing more secrets that they can expect the same fate." Asked how the nerve agent works, he added, "It's for paralyzing people. It causes you convulsions and you can't breathe, and after that you die. If you get enough of a dose of it, it's real torture. It's impossible to imagine. Even in low doses the pain can go on for weeks. You cannot imagine the horror. It's so bad." The Novichok family of nerve agents were secretly developed over 2 decades at a research facility 50 miles outside the Russian capital. Many times more potent than other better-known chemical weapons, Novichok agents can render gas masks and protective equipment useless. Sometimes described as gases, they are in fact liquid, intended to be delivered as a fine spray. A series of poisons, known as Novichok 5, 7, 8 and 9 to identify them, were produced amid conditions of complete secrecy. They all kill the same way, by inhibiting enzymes that control nerve receptors in the brain. One expert said victims simply forget to breathe. A tiny drop, almost undetectable, placed on the skin or inhaled can cause death within minutes. Describing his work, Mr. Mozayanov said they were normal laboratories. They were not underground or anything. They were testing and developing. There were around 1,000 people working on this. It was a big deal. You have to test it on animals, and after that you have to study the chemical properties. So many laboratories were involved. In 1987, one physicist at the laboratory was saved despite being exposed to the chemical when a ventilator stopped working. Witnesses described how he staggered out of the room, describing seeing bright hallucinations before collapsing and being rushed to hospital by the KGB. He was left with permanent injuries after being critically ill for 10 days and unable to walk for 6 months. Last night, experts described nerve agents such as Novichok as second only to the atom bomb as the most deadly weapons ever made. They said that because the ingredients were so common, the poison was ideal for use in an assassination, as well as a weapon of mass destruction. Pharmacology expert Professor Gary Stevens said this is a more dangerous and sophisticated agent than sarin or VX and is harder to identify. It causes a slowing of the heart and restriction of the airways, leading to death by asphyxiation. One of the main reasons these agents are developed is because their component parts are not on the banned list. It means the chemicals that are mixed to create it are much easier to deliver with no risk to the health of the courier. Professor Robert Stockman of the University of Nottingham said traces of nerve agents did not linger. He added, "These agents react with water to degrade, including moisture in the air, and so in the UK they would have a very limited lifetime. This is presumably why the street in Salisbury was being hosed down as a precaution. It would effectively destroy the agent." Russia went into denial early today, with a former FSB chief claiming scientists at Porton Down had poisoned ex-spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. A top Moscow chemical weapons expert echoed the charge while also alleging nerve agent Novichok did not exist. Moscow was scrambling today to respond to Theresa May's demand for an explanation for the Salisbury attack by midnight. In an extraordinary blast, Vladimir Putin's predecessor as FSB Secret Service Chief Nikolai Kovalyov claimed Porton Down government laboratory, which identified Russian-made Novichok as the agent that poisoned the Skripals, was likely to have been behind the attack. "There is a laboratory near Salisbury which is famous all over the world," he dismissively told Britain. "Check if anything leaked from there." Meanwhile, chemical weapons scientist Dr. Anton Utkin, a former UN inspector in Iraq, denied the existence of Novichok and echoed the claim that Britain may be responsible for the poisoning. He led the destruction of chemical weapons in Russia. "I was dealing with elimination of Russian chemical weapons, and with all the responsibility I can say that we have never had a weapon under this name," he said. "Actually, it is very strange that British experts have found out the formula of this super-secret poison nobody knows about. It is not clear either how they managed to determine that it was produced in Russia if you know the technology. It is not possible to find out who made a chemical weapon if the method is the same. The formulas of the substances will be identical. So this news only provokes more questions. Atkin said the West had earlier made a toxic noise about Russia's alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria. And now right in the heart of Great Britain this traitor is killed with a neuroparalytic substance. All this happens at a very convenient time before the Russian presidential election and World Cup. If I were British, I would not blame Russians but check my own security systems first. Something strange is happening there. It is not the first time when criminals are walking around the country with highly toxic and radioactive substances and the secret services have no idea about it. Dr. Atkin has worked for the State Scientific Research Institute of Organic Chemistry and Technology, which is suspected of being behind the development of Novik starting in 1973. Korvalyov, now an MP, said the accusations by May were a provocation against Russia. There was no sense for Russia to seek to kill a spy convicted 12 years ago when the publicity would damage the campaign for the presidential election. He said, just be logical. There is no logic here. He said, England is turning into a dangerous country. If I were to speak for the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, I would have issued a statement that would not recommend our spies and traitors to live there because it is dangerous to these citizens, he said. The chain is already rather long.
Tell me where the freak's at.